With chapter 5, we move out of financial accounting and into the world of managerial accounting. So, what's the difference? Financial, you're primarily your audience is external, right? So financial accounting, your audience is external. That's your bankers, investors, community, right? Bondholders. So financial accounting, it's very rigid, right? It is a structured format. It has to follow GAAP, right? Generally accepted accounting principles, right? This is a legal thing. If you present your financial statements in a way that violates GAAP and you do it on purpose, right? You can get into trouble. You can wind up, that's like fraud. That's known as fraud, right? So you can, if you are producing financial statements and you're not following the rules, you can get into serious trouble. CEOs and CFOs in particular can go to jail for that. And that's because you're supposed to be following a particular format, GAAP, right? Managerial accounting, the audience is internal, right? So whereas financial accounting follows these very rigid rules, and you have some flexibility within them, but they are there because what we want is a standardized report that everybody can follow. Like I said, after this class, even right now, you could go pick up the Amazon, annual report, which is where they publish their financial statements. And you should be able to, it's a little bit different than what we've looked at, but they've got the same basic structure. Income statement looks, it's got 3 parts, basically. It's got its operating revenues, its operating expenses, and then it's non-operating. It's going to look the same. You should be able to read 90% of it, right? You should be able to pick up a Ford Motor Company income statement and read it, because they all follow GAAP, and that's what we've been working on. Now, managerial, and again, the point of that is, right, an annual report is going out to the public because these are publicly traded companies. You can own Ford, you can own Amazon, you can own HCA, right? The company that owns like Portsmouth Regional and Parkland and what's it called up in at Frisbee? How can I forget Frisbee? So in order to do that, though, you have to produce these financial statements, these financial statements that follow this very strict rule. Managerial accounting is internal. So now we're talking to managers in the organization, right? So this is, so the formatting of these things varies by organization. There isn't a standard process. Now, organizations tend to use some similar approaches, and we will look at them. But we are now below the level where you have some legal requirement to produce something. Instead, what we're going to be looking at is trying to provide information for managers to use. So the focus here is information for managers to make decisions. So everything we do for the next 3 chapters is going to be about decision-making and helping managers understand their business and what they need to do to be successful. So this to me was what I used to really enjoy when I worked in finance. I really enjoyed the opportunity to take this information and then sit down with managers and say, let me show you what's going on in your department. Right. And they'd be like, oh, wow, I didn't get that, didn't understand how my decisions were impacting. And then I'm able to help them, rethink how they approach things. So that's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this work. And I think this is a little more fun than the first couple of chapters. So, so the main thing is that it is not as formal. It doesn't follow the same sort of rules. We're going to do some specific approaches in this class, but basically it's going to vary organization to organization, and it's going to change based on what kind of organization you're in and what's important to your organization. But some basic ideas. One subset of managerial accounting is called cost accounting. And like the name implies, so this is a subset. So within managerial accounting, you have cost accounting. Cost accounting, as the name implies, focuses on understanding the underlying cost structure of an organization's processes. So for a healthcare organization, so like let's say a hospital, we're going to look at the revenue that's coming in, and then we're going to look at the different costs that are involved in producing that revenue. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of different kinds of cost going. So we're going to be starting with cost accounting and talking about a couple of different kinds of cost. So you say, well, cost is cost, right? Like, how's that a thing? Like, it's a thing, we're spending money on it. Yes, but this is an accounting class. And so we're gonna drill down into all these different kinds of costs. So let's talk about the first kind of cost is called a fixed cost. So let's imagine you're running a physician practice. If you want to put together a practice from scratch, what's the first thing you really need in order meaning, asset? What's the first thing you really need in order to start a physician practice? You need a place, right? You need a physical place to put the physicians in, right? Where the patients can come. So we're either going to buy a place, right, or we're going to rent one. Right? And if we buy a place, we're probably going to have a mortgage. And even if we bought it with cash, we're going to it's going to be depreciated. So we're going to think about something like even if we owned a building that we're going to put ourselves into, we will want to think about what could we rent this place for? So let's say DeLuna owns a building, right? And she's Dr. DeLuna and she's going to start a practice. And she's like, I own a building. I could put my practice in this building that I already own. I don't owe any money to the bank. I don't owe any, I don't have to rent it from anybody. She's still going to want to imagine, or at least nominally think about, that as if she were renting it. And the reason she wants to think about it as if she was renting it is because she could rent it, right? This is an opportunity cost. If she puts her own practice in her own building, she can't rent that building to Molly, who wants to have, a fashion boutique in there instead. Like, so she's going to, right? That's what you would do if you had like obviously. So, so she would have so she could rent to Molly the space, and then she could earn income on the space. So in a sense, she's renting to herself, even if she actually owns the facility. But let's say that's not the case. So let's imagine that DeLuna's like, hey, I want to start a practice. First thing I got to do is rent some space. How many guys rent a place right now? And in order to rent the place, you sign a lease, right? And what does your lease say? The what? I'm sorry. Yeah, it agrees. Right. So lease lays out the conditions for living there. These are the things you may and may not do. Right. But then it also says, and on the first of the month, you owe me this much money. And it typically says you've got a year contract with me or something like that. Right. And so this is the periodic payment. Now, let's say you go home for the weekend. Does your and so you're not using the place for the weekend. Does your lease payment go down because you weren't there? No. Sorry about that. So no, right? Your lease payments don't go down because you're not using it this weekend. And if you go home for Christmas break, right, and you've got a lease up here, you might be gone for a couple of weeks, place sits empty. Landlord's not like, oh yeah, you're not going to be here. I'll take 2 weeks off, I'll take half your rent off. Nope. Landlord's like, no, you owe me for December. I don't care if you're not there, right? You still owe me for December. That's an example of a fixed cost. Leases are kind of a prime example of a fixed cost, right? The key thing about fixed cost is it does not vary with a change in quantity produced. All right, that's going to be hard to see. I'm going to change back to my marker. So a fixed cost does not vary with the amount of stuff produced. So now let's go back to the DeLuna's physician's office, right? So DeLuna rents a space, right? She rents this space, and it's $1,000 a month. She's got a year-long lease, right? It's got the lease says you pay $1,000 a month. Let's say in month one, because she's just starting a practice, she sees 50 patients. And then in month two, she sees 100 patients. And in month three, she sees 200 patients, and that's her normal. So she went from 50 to 100 to 200. And now she sees 200 a month. In that, does the lease payment change over time because she's seeing more patients? No, the landlord's like, it's $1,000 a month. I don't care what you do in there, as long as you're not breaking anything, right? It's $1,000 a month. You see 50 patients, that's nice. I don't care, right? You saw 100 patients, congratulations, I guess, right? 200 patients, great, good for you, pay me, right? And that's a fixed cost. It's not going to vary depending on how much work DeLuna is doing, how many patients she sees, if it's a lab, how many tests you do, if it's an radiology practice, how many scans you do, doesn't matter. The cost doesn't vary, right, with the quantity produced. So examples are things like rent or other lease payments, right? So we rent buildings. Typically, we're thinking, when you guys are thinking of renting, you might rent a building. So examples, building or some sort of space, but you can also lease equipment. You can lease computer systems. And so forth. So these are examples of fixed costs that kind of fit this rent or lease payments. Other things. What else does a physician practice? Let's focus on a physician practice. What else does a physician practice have that they're going to pay a fixed amount each period for, regardless of the volume that they do? So DeLuna has rented this place. She's moved her stuff in. What are some other things she's got to do to get the practice going? Okay, so utilities, probably, right? So like so utilities kind of depends on which utility we're talking about and kind of they do tend to be tied to some utilization metric, right? So if you're using, like in the summer, you're using more you're using more electricity because of air conditioning. In the winter, you're going to use more oil to heat. So the utilities are going to probably vary some, but not necessarily in conjunction with changes in volume of service provided. So DeLuna's got a cool, like in August, it's hot. She's got to run the air conditioner for her office. And it's not going to vary all that much depending on how many patients she sees, like a little bit, but not much. So utilities kind of a little bit gray. Let's think of some other stuff. So what else? Yeah. Good. For who? Maybe. Okay. Who else? Other employees. All right. So who else has DeLuna got in her practice that probably their pay isn't going to vary based on volume? Should all pick up your phone and turn the reverse camera on and point it at yourself, right? People like you, right, who are going to go out into the field and work as administrators, right? Your pay is particularly early on, is almost certainly not going to be tied to volume, right? If you're hired in, so you know, some of you like have worked in a hospital, and done, say, PSR work. The PSR doesn't expect to see her pay go up and down depending on how many visits they did that day, right? The PSR is like, hey, I worked 8 hours. My hourly rate is $18 an hour. You owe me 8 times 18. Not my fault that you didn't see as many patients as you thought you would today. So some salaries are fixed. So those examples would be, admin staff, probably nursing staff. These are examples of fixed. Some other things that might be fixed. Insurance. Right. Typically, there's a contract in place. They may initially adjust your rate based on what you tell them. So like, for example, when you're setting up your auto insurance policy, they used to ask, or they probably still do ask, how many miles do you drive a year? And we all say something less than what we actually drive, right? Well, we're estimating here. And so, because we know if you say, yeah, I drive like 40,000 miles a year, your insurance rate's going to be higher than if you say I drive 10,000 miles a year. Right? So insurance is typically fixed because, at least for a period, because it's based on some initial estimate of your costs. Depending on the kind of insurance you have, it may bump up over time, but it's typically fixed for a period of time. So that's another example. What else? Yeah, so admin staff, like the secretary, isn't going to expect to have his pay tied to, the volume of physician visits that are done. Now, what about physicians? Well, this is an interesting question. It depends, right? So physician contracts, so that's why I was saying when DeLuna said providers, I'm saying, well, maybe. So it depends. Physician contracts tend to be written with a productivity standard in them. So let's say Sam is a family practice doctor. She gets a contract with Elliot as a provider. They will typically hire her with a contract that says, we're going to, for the first year, you're going to have a guaranteed salary of $250,000. We expect you to generate X number of RVUs. I want to say 2,000 RVUs, right? So your pay after that first year, so first year you're getting 250, we're going to track your RVUs, but your pay is not going to be tied to RVUs. After the second year, if you don't hit your target of 2,000 RVUs, we're going to decrement your pay, right? You'll go from, if you only do 1,500 RVUs, we're going to decrement your pay from 250 to 200. And then we're also going to review your employment contract, right? So, because you're not hitting your target. But if you hit over 2,000 RVUs, then there's a bonus for you. So physician salaries, if you're an employed arrangement, whereas a physician is employed, so like the Elliott Catholic has its own medical group, right? Maine Health Medical Group, right? Formerly Maine Medical Partners, employs most of its physicians. They all have a contract that says something along the lines of what I said, which is you've got an RVU target. If you exceed that RVU target by a certain amount, you'll get a bonus, you'll get a higher amount. If you're below the RVU target, we're going to decrement your pay. So physician salaries and frankly, nurse practitioner and PA salaries are often tied to some productivity standard. So they're not perfectly fixed. But your admin staff, typically, low-level admin staff is based on an hourly rate. They do, so entry-level admin staff, most likely what you'll be doing when you first graduate is going to be an hourly rate. When you get a little higher up, once you become a supervisor and eventually a manager, you are going to be on a salary, and your salary will be a fixed salary. Now, you may have a bonus plugged in there, but your base salary will be a fixed expense to the organization. Does that make sense? All right. Now, something that's important to think about with fixed costs is they are fixed within what we call a relevant range. That's an important phrase for you to know. Relevant range. So what does this mean? Relevant range is a relevant range of volume. Okay. So let's say DeLuna puts together she rents space for her physician practice. It has 4 exam rooms. Right. So assuming she has 4 exam rooms, a provider using 2 exam rooms can see, let's say, 30 patients per day. Right? So when DeLuna goes in there just by herself, her volume, she's using 2 exam rooms, right? She's doing 30 patients a day using 2 exam rooms. How much excess capacity does the organization have if DeLuna is working by herself? So what do I mean by excess capacity? Like, what could the organization do if it was fully utilizing all its resources? So she's got 4 exam rooms, right? She's using 2 of them to generate 30 patients a day, 30 patient visits a day. How many patient visits is the organization capable of doing with this constraint, Molly? 60, right? So why? Right. So we've got one provider using 2 of the exam rooms, 2 of them are sitting empty. So there's excess capacity there. I could hire a second provider who would use the other 2 exam rooms, and then we would be full. all the exam rooms would be used, and we would be seeing 60 patients a day. So if this is volume, and let's say her rent is for 4 exam rooms is 1,000 per month. For up to 60 visits, her total cost would be $1,000. So at 0 visits, her cost is how much? 1,000, right? If she sees nobody, the landlord's like, sorry, pay me. It's $1,000. You rented my place. It's your problem if you don't see any patients, not mine. Pay me my money, right? Or get out, one or the other. So at 1 visit, the cost is 1,000, right? At 10 visits, the cost is 1,000. At 20 visits, the cost is 1,000. At 30 visits, the cost is 1,000. At 60 visits, the cost is 1,000. So within the relevant range of 0 to 60, her cost is 1,000, and it's fixed. It doesn't change. So if she sees, 1 patient, the cost is 1,000. 2 patients, the cost is 1,000. Out to 60. Now let's say she's like, you know what? She hires Sophie, right? Sophie joins the practice, and now it's Dr. Sophie and DeLuna, right? Sophie's in, DeLuna's in exam rooms 1 and 2. Sophie's in exam rooms 3 and 4. They're chugging along doing 60 patients a day. And now they're like, you know what we really want to do is hire Tess as a third doc in our practice. We've got a problem. We don't have enough room for Tess because Tess needs 2 exam rooms too. So if we want to add Tess on, we're going to have to add on additional fixed cost. We're going to have to rent a bigger building, or we're going to have to rent the building next door and knock down some walls, whatever that is. But within that relevant range of 0 to 60, we can't add Tess because there isn't capacity to have a third doctor. So in order to add additional capacity, let's say they can rent additional capacity, 2 more exam rooms. That would give them capacity for 120. Sorry, 4 more exam rooms, 120. So now they have, right? Then the first range they could do 60 patients a day for 4 exam rooms, rent 4 more exam rooms. Now our cost is going to jump to go from 60 to 61. It's going to, let's say, jump to 2,000. I'm going to use 2K there, right? So there's a discrete movement. It's a jump. And then your new relevant range is between 60 and 120. So when you're faced with a problem like this, I will tell you something like the fixed costs, the relevant range for the fixed costs are X, or this additional capacity we're talking about is within your relevant range. One of the things you have to think about is, as a manager, when you get out into the field and you are running a practice, for example, right? You're the practice manager, and you're looking at your demand and you're seeing, you know what, there's a lot of people moving into our community. That's shifting our demand curve out to the right, right? That means that, we have additional demand that we're not meeting. There's a pressure here. How do we know there's pressure? Well, we have people calling and we're turning them away because we don't have appointments. Wow, we could make more money if we hired another provider. Do we have the capacity to bring in a different provider. And you'd have to look, all right, I have exam rooms. Do I have a closet I can turn into an exam room? Whatever. If the answer is no, then you're going to have to say, all right, if we want to do this, we're going to have to take on some additional fixed costs. Now, the danger with fixed costs is kind of what I've been, kind of jokingly saying is, oh, we rented this, DeLuna rented this space. She's only seeing 20 patients, not the 30 that she could see. Then the landlord says, pay me anyway. I don't care that you're not seeing 30 patients a day that you thought you'd see, right? So there's some risk in taking on additional fixed cost. That's going to be called operational leverage, and we'll get to that a little later. Okay, so the relevant range for a particular asset is going to be fixed. So from 0 to 60, her rent is $1,000, right? So the relevant range for $1,000 in fixed costs is 0 to 60. You could also expand that and say, well, the relevant range for $2,000 per month is 0 to 120. Now, you wouldn't want to have 8 exam rooms if you're only seeing 30 patients a day. But if you want to think about a relevant range of 0 to 120, then you'd have a fixed cost of $2,000 a month, not a fixed cost of $1,000 a month. But we'll play around with some more of this later. But the thing I want you to take away here is there's this idea of a relevant range. You buy some sort of asset for the organization to use. Within a relevant range, within a certain range, that asset has the capacity to provide a certain level of service to your organization, whether it's exam rooms, might be computer systems, it might be people like nurses. Like how many exam rooms can a nurse, how many patient visits can a nurse manage? Well, a nurse can probably do more than a doctor. So one nurse might be able to handle 60 patients a day, for example, because they're moving them in and taking them out. Or maybe they handle less. Maybe they need 2, maybe a nurse can only handle 15 patients a day. So maybe you have an MA, instead you hire 2 MAs, medical assistants. And so medical assistants can only do 15 patients a day. And so the cost there is, I need to have, if I want to do 60 visits a day, I need to have 4 medical assistants on staff and I have to pay their salary. And so if I've hired 4 medical assistants, they expect to be paid regardless of the volume that we do. And so the relevant range for 4 medical assistants would be 60 visits a day. And you've got to pay those 4 salaries, right? And so you can pay them, and you can hire them. They'll expect to be paid regardless of what the volume is. Their pay is not going to go up if you do more visits. It's not going to go down if you do less. It's a fixed cost. All right. Now, we have fixed costs, and therefore, which are fixed and don't change. Then we have variable costs. Variable costs, as the name implies, vary with the volume or quantity, depending on, how you want to think about it, produced. So let's say we're giving flu shots, right? Let's say we're giving flu shots. You're going to have the cost of the vaccine. Right? You're going to have the cost of the needles, the syringes, Band-Aids, right? So each flu shot is going to have a cost to itself. Let's say that the vaccine is, $5. The needle is 50 cents. the syringe is $1, the Band-Aid is 10 cents, right? The cost per flu shot would be $5, $5.50, $6.50, $6.60 per shot, right? So if I do one shot, how much is my variable cost? $6.60. I should have picked an even number because it's going to get complicated quick. If I do 2 shots, what's that going to be? 2 times $6.60, $13.20, 3. Quick. No, I'm just kidding. I can't do it either. Right. But the point, if I did, let's do an easy one. I did 10 shots. That's going to be 10 times $6.60 would be $66, right? If I do 100 now, right, $660. What's happening? So as opposed to my fixed costs where I'm chugging along, right, and I go from 0 to 60, right? If I do, here, if I do 10 visits, the cost is still $1,000. Here, and by the way, I'm going to bounce between writing volume and quantity. So just don't get, we're typically going to put some volume measure on the bottom, right? And then on the left side, on the axis, we're going to write cost and revenue when we get to it. So the cash will be on the y-axis and the volume or quantity will be on the x-axis. So when we do 0 flu shots, what's our cost? 0, right? So we're at the origin. When I do 1 flu shot, we said our cost is $6.60. When I do 10 flu shots, right, my cost is going to be $66. When I do, more, I'm gonna run on, even if I did 100, I'd be way over here, right? Basically, what's happening is I could draw a straight line. 5 would be $33. Right. What I'm going to have is for the variable cost, if it's truly variable, if I do no visits, I have no cost. If I do 1 visit, I have 1 unit of cost. If I do 10 visits, I have 10 units of cost. So what I've got is a straight line coming out of the origin, meaning that point where the X and Y axis meet, where both are 0, right? We have a straight line coming out of 0 and going up with a slope equal to what the variable cost per unit is, which in this case is $6.60. So the slope of that line is 6.6 or $6.60. Right? It's going to go up at $6.60. If the variable cost was $27, the slope of the line would be 27. It would be going up every time we did 1 more, you'd get $27 more. I got to stop picking numbers that I can't multiply in my head, right? So 10 times 27 would be 270, right? So if I do 1, it's 27. If I do 10, it's 270. So 5 would be 135 because I can divide 270 by 2 in my head, right? So, so whatever the variable cost per unit is, that's going to be the slope of the variable cost line. Now, if we're going to get, for this class, it's always going to be that way. We can get into more complex stuff later on. We will do a little more complex stuff in econ, but this is a good introduction to variable costs. So the idea here is that every time we do 1 more of whatever the variable cost is, we incur 1 more unit of cost. So the unit of cost here is $6.60. So we do more, we get more, right? Unlike fixed cost, it doesn't change as long as you're within the relevant range. If I'm doing these shots in as part of the doctor's visits in DeLuna's clinic, she does a visit, doesn't matter, it's $1,000. As long as we're still within the relevant range. Some other examples would be you know, things like lab tests. So my dad was, I may have mentioned this, my dad was a physician. He was a pathologist, which means he ran the laboratory at Cheshire Medical Center out in Keene for almost 30 years. And so much of what the laboratory does is run these basic tests. Like, you know, you go into the doctor and they're like, yeah, we're going to draw some blood. We're going to, you know, make you pee in a cup, whatever, you know, and all that stuff goes to the lab. Well, somebody in the lab is running these tests, and they, you know, and there is a cost every time you run the tests, right? So let's imagine for a lab, what would the fixed costs be for a lab? Let's picture it in our head. There's this space. There's some equipment in the space. There are people in the space, like the, what is it? The old, how do you do the church? Here's the steeple, open the doors, and here's the people, right? So now we're picturing, right? We're in our mind, right? We've got this room, right? When I say lab, you should be picturing something, right? I assume it's like a room. Maybe it's with some guy with wild white hair and like lots of test tubes. Probably not in a modern lab, doesn't look like that, right? So it's probably, so you got a space, that's one, right? So they've got to have some space, so that means rent or some sort of lease payment. What else, Molly? Equipment. Which could be a lease. What else? Staff. Good. So there's a technician of some sort running it. Some of your colleagues are over in the COLSA studying to be lab technicians, right? So this is wages or salary. Let's call it salary. Okay, that's good. So let's say, you know, rent is 1,500, the lease on the equipment is 500, and the technician is 500. So fixed costs are 1,500, 500 is 2,000, 2,500. Now, let's say that, you know, a lot of these tests are like, basically the tech loads loads the samples, and then puts the samples into some sort of, you know, equipment, and turns the equipment on, and the equipment does all the rest. And then they take it out, and they, you know, so they're basically there to, you know, I don't want to oversimplify, but they're there to babysit the equipment. You know, they need to understand what's happening, or they you know, so they know if something goes wrong. So the equipment is going to have some capacity, right? It's going to be capable of running some number of tests per day. So let's say that the equipment has, for each piece of equipment, it has a relevant range of 10,000 tests, you know, per day. I don't know, 10,000, whatever, 10,000 tests per per day. I'll just say per day. That's kind of a crazy number, but whatever. So they've got 10, he can run up to 10,000 tests per day. That's 10,000 tests per day. He can run up to 10,000 tests per day. So as long as we're doing with that piece of equipment, so as long as he's doing 8,000 tests, that's fine. He's feeding a lot of stuff in, a lot of stuff coming out, he or she, whatever. As long as we're under 10,000 tests per day, we're good. If we're going to go over 10,000 tests, what do we need to do? Buy another piece of equipment, hire more people, right? So as long as we're under 10,000 tests per day. Now, when we run tests, what do we need? Yeah. Yeah, limitations are given. I'm talking about the costs. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really call this equipment. I would think like specimen collection. Supplies. So if it's urinalysis, they're gonna get, gotta get a cup, right? You're gonna have, if it's blood, you're gonna have to have, those little, the syringe, the phlebotomy stuff. You're gonna have to get the syringe, that funky, the needle, that funky syringe where they take the little tubes and shove them on, So you're gonna have those tubes, right? That's kind of all this specimen collection, and that's gonna be one for each, right? Then you'll have, I mean, I'm kind of building an idea here of the supplies that go into this. So specimen collection supplies, maybe test tubes to run it through. So you're going to take the specimen, put it in a tube, and then you need these things called reagents, which are the chemicals that the lab technician is going to add to the specimen in order to run the test. So that's enough, right? So these are, let's say that this costs, 50 cents. This costs 25 cents. And this costs 25 cents. There, now that's an easy number. So for each test I run, I'm going to need a specimen collection supply of some sort, whether that's a, cup for you to pee in or syringe for me to stick you with and collect tubes of blood from you. We're going to need something to take and put the specimen in so that I can put the specimen into the machine. And then I'm going to add some sort of chemical to your sample so that the machine can do whatever it does, right? To get your sample to reveal how much sugar is in your urine, or how many white cells are in your blood sample, something like that. I'm not my medical knowledge is like this, right? So I can make up some stuff, sort of. So the point here, though, is every time I run one test, I'm going to spend this amount of money on doing the test. So it's going to be $1. So I'm going to have a fixed cost of running the lab. That's the 2,500. And then these are going to be my variable costs. And so my variable cost per unit, VC, I'm going to be abbreviating fixed cost as FC, and I'm going to be abbreviating variable cost as VC. Okay. And I'll be interested in total variable cost as well as my variable cost per unit. Right. I'm going to need both to kind of know both of those. So if I draw my costs here, and I've got my volume, and let's say we're under 10,000, my fixed costs are going to be $2,500. Okay. So if I do 0 tests, it's 2,500. If I do 10 tests, it's 2,500. If I do 2,000 tests, it's 2,500. As long as I stay under 10,000, the fixed cost is 2,500. So let's just draw like a line right here. That's 10,000 tests. Now, if I do one test, what is my total cost? We've talked about fixed costs and variable costs. My total cost is going to be the sum of my fixed costs and my variable costs. So if I do one test, what is my total cost? Molly. Exactly. 2,500 for the fixed costs and $1 for my variable costs because I did one test. If I do 1,000 tests, what is my total variable cost? If I do 1,000 tests, what is my total variable cost? Just the variable. Molly. And how'd you get it? Times 1, right? Yeah, it's not a trick question, right? 1,000 times 1. We did $1 per unit, right? We're doing 1,000 tests. Then my variable cost is 1,000. My total variable cost is 1,000. Now, if I do 1,000 tests, what's my total cost to Luna? 3,500, and you got that by saying, right. So if I do 1,000 tests, right, I have variable cost equal to 1,000 times $1 equals $1,000. And 1,000 is less than 10,000. So my fixed costs are still within the relevant range. So that's 2,500. So my total cost TC is 3,500. Right. So if I'm going to put this on the graph, this is my graph of total costs at 1,000 visits, I'm going to incur 3,500 right here, right? So if I do 0 tests, I have a fixed cost of 2,500 that I have to pay, but I have no variable costs. If I do 1,000 tests, I'm going to have variable costs of 1,000 because it's $1 per test times 1,000 tests gives me $1,000 plus the fixed cost gives me a total cost of 3,500. If I go out to 2,000, my variable cost is now what? $2,000, right? 2,000 times 1, $2,000. Fixed cost, 2,500. Total cost, 2,000 plus 2,500, 4,500. So now I go up here. And it just keeps going like that, right? When I drew my total cost line, where did I start? At fixed cost, right? So the total cost curve is going to cross the y-axis, the total cost axis, at the fixed cost amount, right? Because if I do 0, I've still got to pay the fixed cost. So that's going to be my origin, not my origin, that's going to be my intercept. It's going to be whatever the fixed cost is. So the total cost curve, the intercept is going to be whatever the fixed cost is, and then it's going to go up from there. So at 1,000 tests, this gap is 1,000, right? The gap between the total cost line and the fixed cost line is 1,000. At 2,000 tests, the gap is 2,000. So the gap between total cost and fixed cost is always going to be what? Somebody other than Molly. Come on. What did I just say? It's 1,000, then it's 2,000. That's what? Machine Way. Shout it out. What? Oh, you were thinking you didn't have, okay. Sorry. Well, it's 1,000 at 1,000. The difference between the total cost line and the fixed cost line is 1,000. That's equal to my variable cost, right? That's my total variable cost at 1,000. At 2,000, my total variable cost is 2,000. So the gap between the total cost line and the fixed cost line is always going to be the total variable cost, right? So this gap here is going to be my total variable cost, TVC, total variable cost. So when I'm drawing this graph, which is we're going to refer to as the cost structure, right? The cost structure. When we're drawing this graph of the cost structure, the total cost line will start wherever the fixed cost line begins, right? And the total cost line will start at that point. That will be the intercept. And then it will go up. The total cost line goes up with a slope equal to the variable cost per unit. So in this case, this slope is 1 because for every additional test we do, we incur $1 in variable cost. So the slope of the total cost curve is going to be the variable cost per unit. The total cost curve is going to start, it's going to have its intercept where the fixed cost is, and it's going to go up from there. The gap between total cost and fixed cost is always going to be the total variable cost. So if I was at 8,000, right, I'd have how much in total variable cost? 8,000. 10,500, but total variable cost would be 8,000 visits or tests. 8,000 times 1 is 8,000. Guys do a very good job of like looking at me blankly, like I'm saying something completely bizarre. 8,000 times 1, what is that? I have no idea. How could I possibly answer that question? 8,000 times 1 is 8,000, right? What's the total cost then? 8,000 plus 2,500, 10,500. So the cost structure, right, or total cost is going to be equal to fixed cost plus variable cost. This whole thing is the cost structure. What does that mean? That means that's how the organization, what the costs of running the organization are and how they increase or, with respect to volume. So it's going to be some fixed cost plus, probably should say total variable cost. I'll often write VC, but it's really, you should assume in this case, total cost is equal to fixed cost plus total variable cost. Variable cost. Now you could think of total variable cost as variable cost times volume, or variable cost times quantity, however you want to think about it, whatever's easiest for you. I kind of go back and forth, but so the cost structure is how the costs of the organization increase with respect to volume. Right. So the cost structure tells you how does the cost of running the organization respond to changes in volume. It is. So the variable cost specifically responds is directly tied to volume, but the total cost is going to be tied to volume through the combination of fixed cost and variable cost. So the cost structure is how much fixed cost does an organization have and how much variable cost does an organization have? How do they come together? Some organizations can have a lot of fixed cost and relatively low variable cost. Some organizations have relatively low fixed cost and high variable costs. So, for example, let's imagine a lab. You could have lab A, right, with a fixed cost, very low fixed cost, let's say 1,000, and relatively high variable cost, let's say $10 per test. They're using old-fashioned equipment that maybe requires more manpower to run, maybe requires more supplies to go into it. And then organization B has a fixed cost of, say, $10,000, but its variable cost is $1 per test. Organization B uses fancy equipment that allows them to maybe reduce their supply cost, uses less supplies, but the equipment itself is more expensive. Okay. Another variation would be organization C, fixed cost is 0 and variable cost is, say, 20. So this is an example, this is a common example actually in laboratories. You can get a company that manufactures laboratory equipment, testing equipment, will if you are a lab director, they'll come in and be like, hey, we will give you the equipment. Maybe we're not give it to you, but we will lease it to you for nothing. We will, you sign an agreement that if we come, it's still ours, not yours, right? But you can have it in your laboratory and we won't charge you anything for the equipment, but you have to buy the reagents from us, and the reagents are $20 a piece. So it's kind of like how many of you guys, probably some of you guys have like the inkjet printers where like the printer is like $39, but the ink is $50, right? So basically they're giving you the printer, but then they're trying to lock you into buying their ink. And so that's an example where the fixed cost was buying the equipment, and then the ink is your variable cost. Or you could buy a laser printer where the printer itself is, a few $100s, and then the ink is a lot less, and you can get a lot more. You still have variable cost. It's just lower per unit. So in this option C, I remember my dad specifically talking about this. A vendor came in and said, hey, we'll let you have the equipment, for free. You can rent it to us for nothing, from us for nothing. But you have to use our reagents, and their reagents were more expensive than, so like if you buy a Hewlett Packard printer, cheapo printer, they design it so that it's harder to use knockoff ink, but you can buy knockoff ink. So they don't. So this is a contract you sign with, so there's, let's say 3 different variations here. The cost structure for A, B, and C. Well, C, what does C look like if we're doing cost structure? So here's total cost and volume, total cost, volume, total cost, volume. So let's start with C. What is C's cost structure look like? Molly. Yeah. And it's got a slope of 20. How about B? Someone other than Molly. Linda. Nice. Right. So here you're going up. You start at 0, but you're going up at a really steep rate. Here you're starting really high, but you're going at a relatively low rate. How about over here? Option A. Mishimwe. Good. I'm sorry, the noise. Good. So that's kind of in between. That's like this with a slope of 10. This has got a slope of 1. So which one of these is the best to do? Linda says B. What do you guys think? She was doing this at me. She's like, B. Linda, right? Caroline says yes. The answer is it depends, right? It could be right. It might not be. And it depends on the volume. It depends on your revenues, right? So B, so A is they're using relatively little technology, right? They're using relatively little technology, and they're using a lot of variable costs. So, guys have heard of Lamborghini, the car, Lamborghini? Yes. It's a super fancy car. Like the starting model is like $300,000. Like the starting model costs almost as much as my house. Lamborghini, the Lamborghini car is like handmade in Italy, right? They have very little, relatively speaking, they have relatively low, they don't do any automation. It's like all handcrafted, right? There's a bunch of guys, there's Luigi and, and Vincenzo and, and Lorenzo, Mario's there, of course. He's got to drive, right? So you got a bunch of Italian guys. They're going into the shop with their hammers and they're making your car like themselves, like with their hands, right? That's a very low fixed cost, very high variable cost, right? And variable cost in this case would be the labor. There's a lot of labor involved in that. So if we want to make one more car, you got to hire another Mario and another Luigi to come in and build additional cars. So it's a very high variable cost, relatively low fixed cost arrangement. Now imagine for a minute, I don't know if you guys have seen pictures of like modern, like mainstream car manufacturing plant. If not, I can show you one. It's like all robots, right? It used to be there was like a long supply, the original Ford supply line, right? There'd be a bunch of guys standing and the car would roll by and they're all doing stuff. All those people have been replaced with robots. So today, the people who are running the factory are basically like computer engineers who go around and, and there's a few high level technicians that go around to basically care and feed the robots. And that's it. Like there's like nobody on the floor doing the manufacturing. And so it's all fixed cost. Robot is a fixed cost. They don't complain. They don't ask for a raise. They don't get sick. Right? They break, but they don't get sick. Like they don't decide they really want a weekend off. They just work. And so it's all fixed cost, but it's really expensive, right, to set up. So building a new, Ford's going to kit out a new production line to run, Ford Fiestas or whatever that's going to cost them $1 billion, or more, probably more, to build. But then the unit cost, the variable cost of making one more car is really small, right? So Lamborghini, relatively low. I mean, it's just like hammers and tools and stuff, right? So it's relatively low cost, but really high variable cost. Ford, really high fixed cost, but very low variable cost. When does it make sense to do A versus B? When does it make sense to have low fixed cost but high variable cost versus high fixed cost but low variable cost? What do you think? Are there a lot of Lamborghinis around? No, relatively few. Are there a lot of Ford, I don't know, pick your Tauruses? Yeah, there's tons of them, right? They're everywhere. And maybe not as many as there used to be, but I don't know. Pick your car that Honda Civics, right? Honda Civic. If you look at the Honda line, it's all robots all the time, right? They're making bazillions of Honda Civics, whereas Lamborghini is making like, a couple hundred a year. When you hit very high volumes, it makes sense to automate and to invest in a lot of equipment, right? To make that cost per unit come down. On the other hand, if you're very much a niche production process, and you're doing a relatively low volume, it doesn't make sense to invest in a bunch of robots if you're only going to do a few per year. So you don't make the big investment in fixed costs, and you function with you deal with your higher variable costs. All right, we'll pick up there next time. I'll be in my office today till about 2:00 if you want to come by and ask questions about the econ exam. Joyce, did I see you for a second after? You give me 1 second to clean up and I'll just grab you outside. Sorry?